like to be very, very brief. I'm sorry we're late. We have a lot of presentations to get through, and really I thought that this would be a very intimate afternoon of conference discussing a few issues, and well, it's great to see so many people here this afternoon. I hope that with some of the material that has already been handed out and so on, our basic intention in terms of this afternoon is relatively clear. This afternoon is, in a sense, of course, it's a great opportunity a few days before Christmas, before the millennium. It's a kind of break. It's a moment for us to pause for a minute and reflect and to see whether the current situation in sciences, in contemporary methods of production, in terms of a whole set of issues that we have to deal with, has any bearing in terms of the way in which we think and conceive of architecture in a way. Since Charles Jinx is going to really set the scene, I won't go into too much detail, but just tell you a little bit about the kind of practicalities of this afternoon. Every presentation is going to be around 25 minutes, and the idea is that there would be at the end of each presentation a 5-minute period for questions. And since we're already starting, let's say, 10 minutes late, we're going to add 10 minutes to everything. So hopefully we'll be out of here just after 7 if everything goes to plan. Again, I think there is a bio and all that information that has been handed out, so I won't go into a lot of detail. Charles Jinx will talk about the new paradigm. I'm grateful that Brian Goodwin is here. Brian, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his writing. He will focus more on the issues of the relationship between the biological conditions, and the topic this afternoon is nature at play. Greg Lynn on animating buildings. Alejandro Zauropolo, evolving the discipline. And then we will have a break at around 4:15, and we'll come back here again at 4:45. I will make a brief presentation on anamorphic architecture. Brett Steele from the grad design program here at the AA on brand space, and Ben van Berkel will be the last speaker on public science. I would, just before I hand over to Charles, would like to thank him and Maggie Keswick for really having the generosity to set up the original bequest that sponsors this event this afternoon, and for being the main inspiration behind the conference. We have been thinking about this, planning it for a long time, and I hope that you won't be disappointed. Please welcome Charles Jinx.
Thank you, Moisen. Originally, when we talked about it, it was going to be called the new paradigm in architecture, and as I did say to Moisen, change it if you want, and he wanted to. So it's now called new paradigms in the plural, and we've had a shift in the subject slightly. But be that as it may, one of the themes of this afternoon will be emergence, and when Peter Eisenman and I and others were talking about what we should call the new architecture, we used the word, maybe it should be emergence architecture, but that never took. And Brian Goodwin, who's our token scientist, will be talking about emergence. Other words were complexity architecture, but since Robert Venturi and others had given complexity architecture a different set of meanings in the 60s and 70s, that word had been co-opted. Nonlinear architecture was another phrase. And all of these terms, which I think are pointing to something very, very, very real. The subject of this new paradigm architecture is very real, but its name is perhaps forever elusive, interestingly. And I know that there's a great debate taking place, I've never seen it, but on the internet between the chaos and complexity sciences just over what one should think about it, what one should call it. Anyway, that's sort of a background to some of the questions. I'm going to be asking 3 big questions. today. What kind of architecture or style or language of architecture is adequate to this new view of the universe? Secondly, what iconography or content is appropriate to it? So style and content are both raised by it. And third, what is beauty today, or is the word hopelessly impossible? So those are three questions I'd like to set the afternoon as we look at this new paradigm, or paradigms, together. If I could have the lights off and the first slide. Well, I start off with the last 5,000 years of architectural history, really only 2,500, starting with Plato. And Plato's view of God is the architect of the universe, a well-known 13th century biblical illustration of God laying out the universe with an architectural instrument, a male architect creating something. Plato, the way he describes the designer, first of all, he's described God as the great architect of all things. So it's important to know that God was a male architect who created and built and controlled. In other words, God was the Norman Foster of his day. He was a control freak who really sat down, worked out the problem, controlled it, brought it in on time and budget, and produced a minimal solution. Now, he divided the universe. When he designed the universe, it took him 6 days to design the universe, and that's why he gets all the credit in the Genesis. He broke it into earth, air, water, and fire, and he gave those Platonic languages, styles. As Plato said, behind everything are spheres, cones, cylinders. A quote that every architect and Cezanne since has said, yes, lying behind of all nature, and here's the earth, and you can see air and fire surrounding it, are those Philebin solids. That's what it's ultimately about. And that's what ultimately Egyptian architecture was about, classical architecture was about, Renaissance architecture was about, modern architecture was about, and today even minimal architecture is still about, the language of forms, seen light and shadow. So that system of design and thought underlay at least the West. You could go back before Plato and before Egypt and try to look at another view of the universe and an architecture based on it, and you would get a different system. But I think it's fair to talk about the Western formation because it's even colored greatly the East. And if you look at God working his 6 days, creating all the animals in pairs, you see a happy paradise garden before the fall, before Adam and Eve recognized they were naked, and where the cosmic creation turns into something else, and it turns into a nature that grows and changes. But also, and as one of the reasons I illustrate this idyllic scene of the beginnings of architecture, primitive hut and so forth, which Loge and Gandhi and every architect believed was behind it all, or cave, is an emergent, which is an emergent in theory, and that is revealed, if you look very closely, by that there. Now, if you look closely, you see how it's a complete contradiction of all of this. In other words, Adam has a belly button. Now think about that as a theological problem. If Adam had a belly button, he must have had a mother, right? And therefore, he couldn't have been created ex nihilo by God. So, even God, or the painter of this picture, and this was debated whether Adam should have a belly button. This is the problem of the belly button, which I set as the problem of emergence. The belly button emerged, and it led to a theological dispute. Anyway, let us go on from there, jumping over 2,000 years of history to what we know about nature and the cosmos, two different things but related. We know that it's slightly out of control and often out of control, and even when it's out of control, it generates spirals such as hurricanes, typhoons, and so forth. You can see in this map of America how it is now theorized by, of course, insurance companies and others that these catastrophes, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and other risks, volcanoes, not to mention global warming, ozone layers, and problems. So the designer universe is clearly something we know doesn't work. God is not a male architect who controls everything, or successfully. There's things that get out of control. And the more successful you are, the more out of control they get. In other words, systems pushed far from equilibrium. We are getting more and more successful for the last 30 years at caching fish until in 1989, the most fish ever caught were caught, and then there was a crash, and it's dropped in some places completely down, and whole industries have collapsed. And this collapse cannot be caused only by overfishing. It can also be caused by, other catastrophic things that come from outside, let's say by meteor hits or external catastrophes, but even internal ones. And one of the things about complexity science is it shows those crashes are built into a system pushed far from equilibrium. Just the slightest shift in one, and the whole system, one keystone species goes, and the whole system crashes. So it isn't just overfishing. It is built into systems with feedback and nonlinear systems, and complexity science has changed our view, changed the paradigm of how we view that. It also changed it positively too, because with the knowledge of the last 3.5 billion years of evolution on Earth, we can see certain progressive climbs in spite of these hits by meteors and crashes because of volcanoes and crashes because of things being pushed far from equilibrium. So we have a progressivist view, which is the modernist view. And for a long time it was the Vitruvian view even, that architecture progressed, societies progressed, nature progresses. And indeed, the number of species, even though we're in a mass catastrophic extinction now event caused by us, it's still, the number is going up. The overall number, if you look at the graph long enough. And to come back to the spiral, which I'll return to later, we know that spirals of hurricanes, which cause catastrophes, also cause things to happen very positively. And this is a bloom of plankton bloom, which, in itself is a feedback system that Gaia has used to keep the atmosphere fairly balanced. We now know that we owe more to bacteria and plankton, things like that, than almost everything for balancing Mother Earth. So there are these positive and negative feedback loops, and you can see that our views have changed from a linear world, and here's a linear stretch of an elastic string, which goes into nonlinearity there, and catastrophe. And it brings up the point that although evolution may be progressive at points, it may be regressive at points. In other words, the nonlinearity can make the universe jump up or down. And here is a diagram I produced in a book called The Architecture of the Jumping Universe, which shows those new sciences of complexity, which were a trickle, had become a flood by the 50s, and then quite popular science by the 60s and 70s. And so, as I mentioned at the outset, talked about under chaos sciences or complexity sciences or self-organizing systems or nonlinear dynamics and so forth. Anyway, point of this diagram on the right is that you can take away the 10 of those sciences and you still have a new paradigm. There are enough of them, they're interrelated enough to be, for us, what the deterministic sciences that were for Newton, for the modernist, for Le Corbusier. In other words, for Newton and Le Corbusier, if we talk about that 300-year period of modernism, it was a deterministic universe, it was a reductivist universe explained through a few basic laws of gravity, it was a mechanistic universe run by a machine, God was a mechanic, and it was a materialistic universe. That is to say, the ultimate stuff, as Newton said, was hard, massy, impenetrable atoms, ever so hard you can't break them into pieces. So we had a materialist worldview. It was fought against by many people like Blake and so forth, but ultimately the materialist won, and ultimately, if you go to any downtown city, you can see the result of it. Materialism won. You needn't be Madonna and saying I'm a material girl to believe that. It's just the case. It's still in the driver's seat. So even with, we're talking about a new paradigm, it is not in the driver's seat. It's very much a marginalized paradigm, this new one. And yet, because of that diagram on the right, I think, and because of the youth who know that diagram well, and because of the computer and a whole lot of other things, it seems to me it will be the paradigm in another 20 years. And that's what I've argued in this book, The Architecture of Jumping Universe, How Complexity Science is Changing Architecture and Culture. And basically, the idea is that we need a new metaphor for architecture and for our view of the universe. And out of that leads to the first basic question I pose. What is a style or language appropriate to a jumping universe? And what we'll see this afternoon are waveform architecture, folding architecture. Here's some Japanese version of folding architecture back in 95, the electronic fold. Fractal architecture, anamorphic architecture, vector architecture, strange attractor architecture. That's what I'll be showing a bit. In other words, there's a series of languages of emergent sciences of complexity which begin to argue, or present maybe more than argue, that this, in a dynamic jumping universe, in a universe we know is a single creative unfolding event full of surprises, full of dynamism, much more dynamic than the modernists or the Christians thought, not in control of a male God, a designer, an architect, out of control partly, a universe that looks more gestational than designed. In other words, what emergence, if one sexes emergence, it's more like gestating something in the belly of a woman or a computer than it is an exterior architect fashioning something, crafting it. So that I think, well, anyway, that's the question. What are these languages that I've just mentioned more appropriate? Obviously, I think they are. It leads to the next question. What is an appropriate iconography? That is, what content is appropriate to this style? What should architecture be about? What is the subject matter of architecture? I can remember in these halls when Banham used to address these issues, he said, oh, you people, you architects always have what's style worry and art worry. So now I'm on to art worry. What is the subject? What's the content? Does it matter? In traditional architecture, of course, there was always a stylization of the earth and what was growing. For the Egyptians, pulling reeds together, tying them at the neck, and creating a capital form out of those reeds, which bulged and gave you certain proportions and certain refinements and certain things worthy of expression. So a symbolic architecture then symbolized one's relation to the earth, the mud of the Nile that flooded every year, and the things that grew every year, and the stars, and that was supported by writing and details. So classical architecture and Egyptian architecture has always known iconography, and just to remind you of the origin or fabled origins of the Corinthian, sorry, it's upside down here. But here is a drawing of it, of the woman, the young girl who died, and a pot was put out in acanthus leaves with her belongings, and the acanthus, in the ground, and the acanthus leaves grew around it, and then along came an architect and said, that would be a very good order, and named Corinthia after the woman, and so then they did many versions of it. But an important thing, I mean, in terms of, and they misused it, they put it at the base, the Romans lovely inverted it, and so they knew the rules and broke them, so that the Corinthia's pot was down here, and the acanthus leaves were at the base of a column in Jerash. They took the natural world, that is, and copied nature, direct copy, and then patterned it, stylized it so it would fit onto a three-dimensional curved surface. And architecture was supposed to show our relation to nature, make us relate to nature, make us identify with it. Now, I think the last great architect of this century who has dealt with iconography and style seriously, and beauty, in fact, all these issues I'm posing, is Le Corbusier. And he realized that the old systems were in some senses wrong, although his definition of architecture, the masterly correct and magnificent play of volume seen in light, is based on the classical, as Peter Eisenman kept saying, or would say today. And his first house he published, here you see the side, but there's the elevation, there's the drawing, with his Tracé Régulateur, said these pure forms, when they are proportioned according to regulating lines, become more beautiful. And he really profoundly was the last great architect, I think, to have a theory of beauty based on mathematics and proportion, because he thought, he very much read that the universe has these mathematics, and his attempt was to find out what they were, and he thought, at this stage, he thought they were these traces regulateurs, they were these proportional systems. But he also had, quite separate from that, a whole argument about iconography based on ocean liners, and towards an architecture, not towards a new architecture, towards an architecture, should now today look at boats. Later on, the body and its proportioning system. And in the AA, and this is a slide, he lectured here in 1953, you see somewhere, if I can find it, yes, here, the stele of, what does it say? Can someone read that? Was it Andrew? What does that say? Measure. Of measure, okay. So there's the human body there, and the Unité d'Habitation, as you drew it there in the school, was meant to mediate the measures of the body were related to the land and the building. And so this iconography, it wasn't an abstract architecture. It wasn't just aesthetic. It was very much, he had all sorts of different kinds of content that he compared it to. The architecture is a motor car, or architecture is ships, and architecture is airplanes. So he provided an iconography, and the iconography was basically mechanistic. I mean, these are machines, and that became the primary one for the modernists. Now, recently, in the last, I would say, 10 years, we have begun to understand that those spirals you looked at, those spirals that emerge out of nature, out of the plankton and out of hurricanes, catastrophic or growing spirals, that is, or positive or negative spirals, have also different reasons. And about 1994, 1995, we began to understand that the pine cones and pineapples and all those spiral things that close pack generate these spirals that fascinated Le Corbusier. And here you see a red series and a silver series I drew on a pineapple, or here's a pop pineapple. We now understand through an incredibly sophisticated form of magnetizing droplets why this spiral emerges. Corbusier always thought that the spiral was God's language, that mathematics was in nature. And if you read his books, 2 books on the modular, he really profoundly believed that God was a mathematician, exactly what Plato said. And now we have a different understanding of that, and we can show why those pineapples, for instance, have to grow in a certain order. And therefore they generate, in other words, it's the pattern that's deeper than the mathematics. That's the big point. It's the pattern, not the mathematics. Corbusier, or the geometry, is the pattern. Well, it's geometry in motion, as it were. That's the ultimate thing as an iconography. And that leads to the next question, the third question. What is beautiful today? Well, beauty had been thought to be absolute to this mathematics up until the 17th century, as you know. And then from then on, more or less, when they measured all those columns, they found they were all different. They realized there was no great mathematics underlying it. And then the notion that beauty was in the mind or eye of the beholder became the major view, and proportional systems became, a quote, a matter of choice, i.e. they were no longer important. Because either the mathematics and the geometry is an argument or it isn't. You can't have it both ways. You can't say on Monday, Thursdays, and Fridays proportion is important, but the rest of the week it isn't. Actually, they do say that about quantum mechanics, so maybe you can say it. I should probably take that back. But I bring up the Taj Mahal. It is a beautiful building, at least. It is conventionally beautiful, and if you go there, you find it beautiful. And from one view, the classical view, you can see its self-relations, the way it uses certain forms in an incredibly consistent, transformational way. It's beautiful because of its content, because it was created for love of a man's wife. In other words, its content symbolizing heaven and the relation to God, as it does in its iconography, and the relation to the natural world, is part of its argument for being beautiful. It isn't just the forms. It's beautiful perhaps because of its fractal quality, because of its self-similarity of all those domes. So it seems to me it's beautiful in a conventional sense. But beauty, of course, is a word which artists and architects haven't been happy to use for the last 120 years, except, as I say, Corbusier used it often. And when I recently went there, I was told to go see it when you can't see it. In other words, it's best to be seen in the mist. So there is paradise, unfinished, and an imaginative projection. This brings up a point of aesthetics and beauty, is that you have to be able to project into it your hopes and wishes and desires of the future. In other words, it's beauty, our perception of beauty, if such a thing exists, has to do with projection. What is therefore proper for projection? And it seems to me that if the first, well, one of the answers is that beauty is about patterns, and we now know not necessarily God-generated mathematical problems, but patterns which are complex and emerge out of forms. Then it's not a particular set of proportions that's important in defining beauty, but it is pattern making squared. Pattern making about pattern making. That is, pattern making which reflects back onto itself. Pattern making which develops a language of rules which it innovates in. So the first answer, I think, is that beauty is about complex pattern making which reflects back on itself. But the next and the counter definition of beauty could be, and has been to me, put forward by Anish Kapoor, who, when I pointed out, when I just said what I said, he said, no, but what about beauty as no pattern? Beauty as absence of pattern. Beauty as the void. Beauty as, and you think of his work and how it engages you to project into that future state, anticipate that future state. I don't have his work to show you, but I have two symbols of projection here, a slime mold out of focus and a void. If you look into that void of Andy Goldsworthy, you see there is a great argument that beauty is not only complexity. Another aspect of that is that beauty we feel today is ugliness, which of course is an oxymoron or a hard contradiction which one has to wrestle with. And it seems to me these Chinese yellow wax rocks show that the most. They're really incredibly contorted, obviously made by nature, but put on pedestals by Chinese artists and have for 2,000 years. And what's so fascinating about the Chinese aesthetic is that it forces us to look at this larger definition of beauty as ugliness, as repulsion, as really repugnant. If you look at those pustules and you look at that lugubrious over-wax, it isn't wax, the wax comes with the rock. It really, you find it lugubrious and horrible. One searches for oleaginous, the right adjectives, oleaginous, just slimy and yuck. But we can enjoy it, and even enjoy it, and we say it's beautiful. And I think it's true of so many works in the last 100 years that we enjoy their ugliness, distortion, breaking of all of the rules, both of form and content of 2,000 years, and we find it, or we say beauty. So, ugliness and this expanded definition. I show you two views of Bilbao, which are as ugly as I could get it. Since this is what the photographers don't show you, to remind you that it is a very ugly building. It's very awkward, very nasty, horrible. I'll come back to that. I want to just show my own work for 3 minutes. That's what the time I have. Based on a language of strange attractors, self-organizing forms, the Jupiter, the red spot, and the jumping universe as a metaphor. The idea that two reasons. We want to relate to the universe, and so we do instinctively. And secondly, because as we understand the universe, our understanding changes over time, so we're engaged by change in knowledge. And one of my theories is that it's the change of knowledge which is an attractor for beauty. In other words, why do we find certain things, like Bilbao, so exciting, is because they represent a change in knowledge at the point at which it's growing. Anyway, for the universe shown in 4 jumps, energy, matter bent by space and time, life, and consciousness. I've shown a symmetry break terrace here, which takes up ideas which broke in 1915, general theory of relativity, that space and time were bent, and by extreme collapse of matter into black holes, and that's warp space and time. And so for a terrace, some of these waveforms, soliton waves, go through each other, undulate and terrace for eating on, with the event horizon ripping the space apart in black lines of force here, energy lines ripping space apart, distorting gravity, and you walk into it and you fall in two directions. So the gravity actually works performatively. And space is stretched, so there's stretch marks on this, and time is compressed so that the elements get closer until you get to singularity, and then it erupts out in a baby universe, and that baby universe has its black hole, and that comes out in a galaxy, another black hole, and out of that is another black hole, and it all works. Anyway, symbolic architecture based on new emergent view of the universe. To end, I come back to Bilbao and the acceptably beautiful shot, and point out that really it's this building which sets, I think, the paradigm for the present, and is a kind of standard for us because it does summarize so much of those languages I've mentioned, so much of the new sciences, at least as language, and above all as computer-generated, CATIA-programmed fractal waveforms. Of course, it has precedents, many precedents, as you see there. But secondly, it relates us to the things around it. That is the river, the Nervion River, which it reflects when it's green or blue, the mountains, the grass, and above all, the sun, the sunlight. It's the greatest mood changer I've ever seen. So it's an exact litmus test of the weather. So it really relates us to the cosmos as well as being all those other things. Thank you. The next speaker is Brian Goodwin, and he, as you can see from what is written in the program, has written a wonderful book on the new paradigm called Why the Leopard Changed His Spots. Brian, sorry? Oh, 5 minutes of question. Oh, sorry, 5 minutes of question. Sorry, there's 5 minutes of questions. Does anyone have any questions? Why do I leave economics out of the global story? Well, I don't, actually, in my book. In an extended, I brought up the crash in fish. And there's a direct connection between the economy and the ecology. So clearly, I wouldn't like to leave economics out of any extended discussion. I mean, I wouldn't. So I alluded to it, but, I'm just concentrating on other things. Other questions?
social emergence and a new complexity of social relations that could overlap structures of the universe. It's all the other way around. Architecture is first. Even before it's conscious, it is a kind of socio-economic, or let's say, quasi-natural metabolism of man in formating its own culture, in a metabolism with nature and evolving architectural structures, which are then kind of, in the division of labor, translated into processes of representation of these structures. They become category of thought, terrorizations, the wall as a dichotomy, the inclusion, exclusion that becomes the logic of the order of subsumption. And the universe is just the picture of the city structure which has emerged. This is the way around, and it's still the way around. One more. Even the new paradigms in terms of new biology, physics, and all the rest of it, I think the epistemological roots come out of social process and social dynamic, are first emerged in sociology problems of the writing of history, Hegel's dialectic, Marx's dialectic, Durkheim, etc. That leads Marx to stir up new categories of reflection. I think there where the dynamic lies. Okay. This way I'm claiming we got it all upside down and
okay.
Don't recognize the relevance of the current world.
I agree. Yeah, that's a cheap remark. But you saying I got it all upside down it leads to a great debate, and I would love to have it with you a little bit later. Yeah, if we could have Brian Goodwin now. Brian Goodwin.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here again. It's several years since I last talked to perhaps another generation of architecture students. But as I say, it's always interesting for a biologist, a scientist, to come into a context like this and to see where we are going in a similar direction and where perhaps the emphases are a little bit different. Let me just pick up some of the themes that Charles introduced as they are relevant to the sorts of work I'm doing in biology. First of all, the sciences of complexity. This is, of course, a dialectical emergence from the study of complex dynamic systems. And what I find so intriguing about it is that it really does carry some very profound shifts of orientation and action. As Charles has already alluded to, they have a lot to do with the social dimension. So we're obviously transcending this nature-culture divide. The whole emphasis, as I see it, in the sciences of complexity is the recognition that the real systems in the world on which our lives depend, such as ecological systems, communities, economies, health, these are complex systems in the sense that they cannot be predicted and controlled. Now, prediction and control, of course, is the dominant mode in which knowledge has been accumulated in the Western tradition since Galileo and before. So it's reliable knowledge of nature in order to control and manipulate nature. Now, that works fine it works very well in many areas, such as clocks and machines, computers, a whole range of technologies that depend upon the control, manipulation, control, design, it's God, the architect, that Charles was referring to. But of course, these complex dynamic systems don't work that way, and we now know why. And it's, of course, chaos and complexity theory, that is to say, that sensitivity to initial conditions and the unpredictability of these emergent properties that come out of complex systems that lie at the heart of this realization that we cannot control these systems on which the quality of our lives depend. And of course, we've assumed that we can, and that's why we're in trouble. So, we have no adequate theory of health. We're destroying a lot of the ecosystems. There's a major extinction spasm going on. And these are things that are unexpected consequences of what appeared at first to be small perturbations, tiny changes in temperature of the Earth's surface, but nevertheless they are beginning to disrupt things. So the sciences of complexity then are the location of really some major shifts of attention in science. And the question is, if we can't control these systems, then how are we to behave? Because we certainly influence them. And one way of answering this is to say, well, we actually have to learn to walk softly and carry a big heart. In other words, we have to learn how to participate in an intrinsically creative and unpredictable world. Now, in a sense, that's a very old perspective. There's nothing new about it. It's just that we, for 500 years, have deviated from a path of what you could call, wisdom. But I don't want to really emphasize that aspect of it. I just want to say these are wonderful opportunities for moving on now and for changing the way in which we relate to nature. And this is where the nature-culture divide actually can begin to be healed. And then we enter a realm of education in which the division between the arts and the sciences also diminishes. Because if we're going to walk softly and carry a big heart, then in fact we need to cultivate the intuition and a sense of the aesthetic and an appreciation of the intrinsic values of these natural systems. So this is a major shift in our sort of educational focus from control to participation. Now, the way I'd like to enter this realm of the celebration of the natural creativity of the world is to look, first of all, at a little organism doing its thing. It's just doing its own dynamic thing. And it's going through this extraordinary process of creative emergence. Simple rules of interaction between these cells, and I think probably some of you will have seen this before, but I think the images are so striking. And they show you that in biology, we get similar phenomena to what goes on in the galaxies on a rather different scale and with different mechanisms, but nevertheless with similar types of pattern. But what I want to stress is the dynamics. It's not the static form. It's the dynamic form that's constantly changing and emerging. And furthermore, the fact that you always get diversity. As Goethe said, the true Proteus, which is the generative heart of the living realm, is constantly changing. And yet, it has intrinsic principles of order. So we have this diversity and order manifesting at the same time. So let me just tune you in to this little organism first. This is the delightful cellular slime mold, and this is the life cycle. Of course, all organisms live in terms of cycles, and you will notice that it starts off as single cells. You'll see some of these moving around, these amoebae, and then they aggregate. And during the process of aggregation, they do this wonderful dynamic dance, and that gives rise to this slug, which migrates around, and then we'll see the emergence of the fruiting body. Now, these are tiny. It takes about 100 of these amoebae end to end to make a millimeter. So they're about 10 microns in size. The slugs, these guys, migrating slugs, they're about a millimeter or two, and they constitute somewhere between 10 and 20,000 of these cells. Nothing is in charge. There is no designer. Biologists like to think that there is a designer in there, which they call the information in the DNA. Don't be misled by that. The DNA is setting up initial conditions for this life cycle, but then the dynamics takes over. In other words, it's the whole process of evolution, natural selection, and so on. But the dynamics is something that is an emergent dynamic, which we're only beginning to understand. So, if we could have the video, we'll just have a look at this. So that's a single amoeba, and during this early phase, the vegetative phase, these amoeba migrating around, engulfing bacteria. But once they starve, they start to change their behavior and they begin to interact with each other by signaling. Now, notice those pulses of signal traveling out, and they immediately begin to gather together. They aggregate. Thousands of them come together. Now, they form these streamlines like, like water flowing in the reverse direction. So this is the pulsatile signal that's transmitted from cell to cell. This is speeded up and magnified enormously. You notice that center up here, that's where the signal is originating, from a set of cells up there, propagating out, and this brings about the aggregation. Now here is this magnificent galaxy. You know, it's a spiral now. So this looks rather like a heartbeat, but the difference is that if you've got a spiral heartbeat, your ventricle is in ventricular fibrillation, and that's not good news for the heart. Now this is where the slug is formed, this collection of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 cells. There's no differentiation of these cells. There are no muscles, no nerves. They're just interacting with each other, leaving a slime sheath behind as they go. You notice the tip pulsing away. That pulsing rhythm persists right from the very beginning of aggregation. Crash. Now, eventually, two types of cell do differentiate in the course of this migration, and you'll see what's called the culmination phase. If this separates into two, each of those components regulates to form a complete whole. So it can divide and subdivide. It makes a whole out of each part. Now this is the phase called culmination. It's taking off into the void, but in fact it's forming this fruiting body. And the two different types of cells are readily distinguished here, the stalk cells here, and these spore cells. And these are the guys that are going to survive and produce the next generation. Biologists sometimes ask the question, why is it that some of these cells actually make stalk, which means their genes cannot persist into the next generation? They're behaving altruistically with respect to the rest of the cells. And so this is a big problem for biology seen from the point of view of selfish genes. But the answer is very simple. If this process didn't occur, and if these cells didn't start the process by pulsing, because they're the ones that form the stalk, are the ones that in fact are the ones that initiate the whole process. So it's a holistic, emergent dynamic, and you cannot understand it as a collection of parts, which is what biology tends to prefer to see organisms as a collection of parts. Well, I think we'll terminate the video there. Thanks very much. Now these, can you hear me if I speak from here? All right. I'll go back to talking. Another solution. Okay, so now this is just to show you that these are computer simulations of these processes, just to show you that we actually do understand what's going on and why these particular patterns form. Now, it turns out that once again, it was believed that as these different stages occur, it was genes that were switching on and directing these new activity patterns. But that turns out not to be the case. This is an unfolding of different, starting off with concentric circles as these propagating waves, then spirals, and then these streams, and then the slug. And the whole thing is a continuity. As I say, it's a dynamic continuity, and there are these bifurcations which are natural to the dynamic. So that in order to understand it, you have to understand it as a whole, as a unity that goes through, as I say, a dynamic series of bifurcations so as to produce these different stages of the process. Now, of course, that is not exactly nature at play, which is my title. The sorts of processes you observe here are processes where are an intrinsic part of the life cycle, and they serve the survival of the organism. They have a functional aspect. It's not function that explains the origin of these dynamic patterns, but it's function that explains their persistence. They work. In other words, this is a life cycle which is robust and can perpetuate the species. So what we're seeing is a mixture of structure and function. Structure in the dynamic sense, these emergent patterns. But what I'd like to look at now is a case where, in fact, we do see nature at play. And what we have here is patterns. These are pigment patterns on the shells of marine mollusks. Now, these mollusks have an opaque mantle over the shell while they're alive, and they also live buried under the sediment. So other members of the species don't see them. They don't see these patterns. They're not visible until the animal dies, and the opaque mantle is sloughed off, and then the pattern is revealed. And so if I could have the first slide, please, just to show you what these look like. I'm sure these are relatively familiar to you, but you see this diversity of forms. This is the genus Clythum, and there's this beautiful variability, and yet there is an underlying generic order to that set. So diversity and unity, and the challenge for science is to understand what is the generative unity. Can we actually grasp what it is that is the dynamic generator? As in the case of the slime mold, we can understand how these interactions between the cells and the dynamics of the cells themselves give rise to these patterns. Now, what's going on in this case? Can we actually get hold of this? And these slides are actually from a book by Hans Meinhardt, who has produced a quite convincing theory, a mathematical theory of how these patterns are generated. Now, just because you produce some mathematics that can generate the patterns doesn't mean you've explained them as they occur in the organism. But nevertheless, I think this is a fairly convincing case that Hans has achieved. And he has simulated all the patterns that I'm going to show you. He has simulated with computer modeling all these different patterns. Now here you can see both the entrance to the shell and the change in pattern that occurs in the neighborhood of this growth region towards the end of this has terminated its growth. And here is the pattern on the other side. And you notice there are different wavelengths here. So that although clearly there are periodicities running throughout, there are shifts in the dynamic, the underlying dynamic, to generate these. Let's have a look at another one. Now here's where you see a similar range of wavelengths that break from one frequency into another, one spatial frequency into another. And this is the computer simulation. So Hans has managed to, by altering parameters, now he's using the same equations to generate both these. Now I'll show you the equations in a moment, just in case you're curious to see what they look like. And by changing parameters, he gets different expressions of the pattern. But it's the same underlying pattern generator. Now here we have these remarkable fractal-like structures, self-similar structures, that also arise with the same set of equations. In other words, what we've got here is equations, these are nonlinear partial differential equations, which can produce either very regular patterns or really quite irregular patterns of this type. And again, Hans has succeeded in generating these, and there are different models that people have proposed for this type of process, but I think that the main thing is to see how they can all arise from one single pattern generating mechanism. Now, what on earth are these patterns doing, though? Why are the organisms producing such beautiful patterns? Because, of course, if you think of pigment patterns in butterflies, you say, oh, well, they're there because they're communicating something about the nature of the species, whether they taste good or bad, some kind of communication. I'm into question time. Thank you. Oh, I got 5 minutes more before questions. Okay. Well, I'm nearly finished. I mean, that's the question to ask. Why are these organisms producing these patterns? Because, of course, in a Darwinian world, if things are not useful, they don't persist. And it's function that is regarded as the source of evolutionary stability. If something is not useful, if it doesn't work, it's not going to persist. And so if there's no selection for pattern, you would not expect to find pattern. Here there's no selection, because these patterns serve no function. Now, when I say that, I can never be categorical. Somebody might come along and say, they do serve a function, and here it is. We've never thought of that before. But so far, there's absolutely no evidence that these serve a function. And this is true of quite a lot of biological patterning. They don't serve functions. The phyllotaxis patterns that you see in plants that Charles mentioned, I mean the pineapple and the arrangements of leaves, there are only 3 of those. Now, you could have an indefinite diversity of patterns of leaves on plants that would all serve equally well, but for some intrinsic reason, intrinsic to the dynamics of the generative process, you only get these 3 patterns. There's a spiral, and then there's the whorled, and then the disticus, as you get in monocots. So it's this question, where do these patterns come from and why are they there? Well, this is an expression of the intrinsic nature of these organisms. You could say they like to produce patterns. That's their nature. Here are computer simulations of those, just to show you the sorts of course, they're much more regular than the ones, because that's the other thing, that biological processes are exquisitely context sensitive. They have this sensitivity to initial conditions and to context. So you get variation. So you get both the pattern and the variability. There's yet another. Pretty good simulations, I think you'll agree. These are pretty convincing. And I think that's the last one, just to show you again, the patterns that emerge. Right, I think that's the end of the slides. So we could have that off, and I'll just draw my conclusions. The whole notion of play in biology is something, again, that doesn't fit very well with a natural selection, a functionalist mode of interpreting the origin and persistence of biological forms. On the other hand, we know that animals play. I mean, dolphins play, monkeys play. There's even study of fish by Konrad Kortmulder, showing that fish show play-like behavior. Now, what is play? Play is some kind of spontaneous expression of dynamic pattern which has no function. It has no obvious function. And so, as I say, in a functionalist biology, that doesn't sit very well. So play is a real problem. On the other hand, if you just think about the intrinsic dynamics of these patterning processes, you will say, well, the whole thing is a play. It's a sort of dance through evolution of potential, exploring what can arise. And then some things work and some don't. But not everything that persists needs to work. It's just a manifestation of these intrinsic patterns. So if we think about architecture, of course, then presumably there's an equivalent process of play, but very strong constraints on what is finally produced. So I'm not sure exactly how to translate this kind of complex ordered dynamic in the biological realm into the architectural realm. But fortunately, that's not my job, so I'll leave that to you. I'll stop there. Charles would like me to say something about concept of beauty. I would relate this to this perception of intrinsic value in the organism. In other words, instead of seeing organisms as functional entities, we see them as having value in themselves. And these complex dynamic systems reveal themselves through qualities. And one of these qualities is their beauty, what we appreciate as their aesthetic value. And it is simply intrinsic. It's got nothing to do with whether that organism is going to be useful to us or not, but just an appreciation of the fact that it is an emergent creative form. It should be valued as such. And therefore, our attitude to the natural world be one that much more like the sense of the sacred that indigenous cultures. I don't want to romanticize indigenous cultures, but nevertheless, it's something we seem to have lost in our culture.
Do you make any distinction between any patterns and a theory of beauty, or are they all patterns equal in terms of your work?
I would not classify these into those which are more beautiful and those which are less beautiful. No.
So just patterns per se.
Patterns per se.
As far as you go.
Yes. Yeah. Mm.
What do you think of the theories of Wigram, Singer, and Hoyle concerning the cosmic origin of the gene, perhaps as a method of giving animals genes for which they have no purpose?
Repeat the phrase, please.
Hoyle and Wigram's theory of the cosmic origin of the gene. Do you think there's anything in it?
Oh, I see. Sorry. This is the extraterrestrial origins of genes and life. Is that right? They may be right. I don't think it begins to address the issues I've been talking about because the evidence as we have it on so far is that life must originate somewhere. If it's been transferred to Earth from some other planet, then our problems about the origins of life just get transferred to another planet. So I'm not sure what is added of significance by the hypothesis. Ah, yes. I hope you can see that. It's not very visible, but a pair of coupled nonlinear partial differential equations, parabolic, and explanation of the different components in the equation. And to get more complex patterns, you just have to make your equations more complex and add a couple more equations. So it gets quite elaborate. It's not quite so elaborate as Ptolemaic epicycles, but it's getting on that way. But nevertheless, it's got an intrinsic dynamic order that is constant throughout this. It's a reaction-diffusion process, and it becomes more complex. But I think these are quite plausible mechanisms for what actually goes on in the metabolism of the organism when it's laying down these patterns. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. The question is asking, wouldn't it be simpler to represent these as one-dimensional cellular automata? And that, in fact, the cellular automaton description has also been used for these. And when I said that just because we have equations that simulate the patterns doesn't mean we have the mechanism. Now, the thing about a cellular automaton mechanism is that the rules that you put in for these don't clearly translate into metabolic processes in the organism having to do with pigment pattern formation. So although the cellular automaton is a very powerful way of generating patterns, it's not entirely clear to me that it is as close to the actual generative process as these equations. But I'm not ruling them out by any means. It's just that there hasn't been that type of interpretation yet of how the rules translate into biochemistry. Beg pardon? Oh, absolutely. It's dynamic. Oh, yes, I'm not disputing that. It's the CA it depends upon, as you know, rules of interaction between neighbors. And it's not clear that the rules that are used in cellular automata actually represent the sorts of rules that are going on in interaction between cells in the organism. But I don't by any means rule it out.